see so rubbish everywhere.
This useless Labour government are doing the impossible. They're actually making things worse. They really are. Look who we've got running the country at the moment. Free gear Keir. Or never hear Keir. We've got Rachel from Accounts. We know her, don't we? Angela Rayner, the no-brainer.
But if the police decide to issue me with a fixed penalty notice, I would, of course, do the right thing and step down.
For the British public, the effect was devastating. What little trust remained in Labour evaporated. Families struggling with rising mortgages, higher taxes, and stagnant wages felt betrayed, abandoned by a government that promised fairness but delivered chaos. Town hall meetings turned hostile, with furious voters demanding answers that never came. "Where's the money?" became not just a question, but a national chant, shouted at rallies, painted on protest banners, and trending online every single day. For Labour candidates, the campaign trail turned into a gauntlet of humiliation, with doors slammed in their faces and lifelong supporters pledging to vote elsewhere. Nigel Farage, sensing history in the making, pressed his advantage. Reform UK rallies swelled to unprecedented sizes, with chants of "send them packing" echoing through town squares. His attacks grew more personal, portraying Starmer as a liar, a coward, and a thief of public trust. The Conservatives, once broken and humiliated, seized the moment as well, with Rishi Sunak painting himself as the steady alternative to Labour's chaos. For the first time in decades, the election no longer looked like Labour's to lose. It looked like Labour had already lost. Markets delivered their verdict too. The pound dipped further, mortgage rates climbed, and investor confidence wavered. Commentators warned of economic instability not seen since the darkest days of Brexit. But for the public, these warnings mattered less than the image burned into their minds. A Prime Minister exposed, panicked, and isolated, fighting not for Britain's future, but for his own survival. Every attempt Starmer made to pivot back to policy, on schools, hospitals, or the cost of living, was drowned out by the same relentless question: what happened to the £22 billion? And then came the most devastating blow of all. Just days before polling, leaks emerged suggesting that investigators were preparing to recommend charges against senior figures in Starmer's government. The names were not confirmed, but the implication was unavoidable. The scandal had reached the highest levels, perhaps even Starmer himself. The story dominated every channel, every paper, every headline. For Labour, it was the end of the road. For Starmer, it was the moment his gamble turned into a nightmare. On the eve of the election, Britain was no longer debating who would govern. It was debating whether Keir Starmer could survive politically at all. Supporters who once believed in his promise of competence now spoke of betrayal. MPs who once defended him now plotted life after him. And voters, weary of broken promises and furious over billions gone missing, stood ready to deliver their verdict. The man who had built his reputation on order and stability had plunged his party into chaos and his country into doubt. His early election gamble, meant to be a masterstroke, had instead exposed every weakness, every failure, every hidden truth. And as the nation prepared to cast its vote, one haunting question remained. Had Keir Starmer not only destroyed his career, but also dragged Labour to its worst defeat in living memory? The answer, whispered across the country, was about to be written in the ballot box. The nation just witnessed a moment no one could have predicted. In front of flashing cameras, with his voice measured but his eyes betraying the weight of panic, Keir Starmer stood before the country and stunned Britain by announcing a snap general election. Not months from now, not in the carefully planned timeline his advisers had been whispering about, but now an early election that ripped through Westminster like a political earthquake. For a man whose leadership was already teetering under the crushing weight of scandal, this move was nothing short of reckless. And for many, it felt like the desperate act of a Prime Minister who knows the walls are closing in. Within seconds, social media ignited, with hashtags demanding his resignation, soaring to the top of trending lists, while opposition leaders sharpened their knives, calling it the most shameless political gamble in modern memory. But behind the cameras, the real story is far darker, because this wasn't just a decision about timing. It was about survival. A £22 billion scandal, whispers of criminal investigations, and a mutiny within his own party have left Starmer cornered. And now, instead of facing accountability, he has dragged the entire nation into his fight for political life, and people are asking, where is the money gone? The fallout from Keir Starmer's shocking election announcement began the moment his words hit the airwaves. For weeks, the Prime Minister had faced mounting pressure to explain the mysterious black hole in public finances, £22 billion that simply could not be accounted for, a gap so vast it made headlines across every major paper, rattled markets, and sent shivers through Whitehall. Until now, he had danced around the issue, insisting that independent auditors were resolving minor discrepancies. But the truth was far more sinister, and Starmer knew it. Investigators had already begun circling his inner circle. Leaks pointed to missing documents and questionable transfers tied to government contracts, and rumours spread that evidence was closing in. An early election, then, was not an act of confidence. It was an escape hatch, an attempt to reset the narrative before the scandal consumed him completely. Inside Westminster, the announcement detonated like a bomb. Labour MPs, blindsided by the move, scrambled to make sense of what had just happened. Some hailed it as bold, even brave, arguing that Starmer was seizing the initiative. But most saw it for what it truly was, a catastrophic gamble. In hushed tones, backbenchers muttered that they had been forced into a fight they could not win, dragged into an election campaign with their leader under criminal investigation and their party fractured by open dissent. The whispers of mutiny that had once been confined to late-night drinks in Parliament bars now echoed openly in committee rooms, with senior figures demanding answers. Why risk everything now when the scandal was still unfolding? Why gamble the future of the party on a timeline no one wanted? Beyond Westminster, the reaction was equally ferocious. The Conservatives wasted no time in branding Starmer a coward running from accountability, accusing him of dragging Britain to the polls simply to protect himself. Nigel Farage and Reform UK, already riding a wave of popularity, struck even harder, framing the move as proof that Labour feared the people's voice. "This isn't leadership," Farage declared at a rally within hours of the announcement. "This is panic dressed up as democracy." The line spread like wildfire, replayed endlessly on television and shared across millions of screens online. Meanwhile, ordinary voters, already furious over broken promises and rising bills, saw the announcement not as a return of power to the people, but as another betrayal, a distraction from the unanswered questions about billions of pounds gone missing. Financial markets reacted just as savagely. The pound dipped, bond yields crept upward, and City analysts warned that investor confidence could collapse entirely if the government failed to explain how it planned to plug the £22 billion hole. Starmer's carefully crafted brand, the image of a steady hand after years of Tory chaos, was disintegrating in real time. The sight of Rachel Reeves, his Chancellor, breaking down on live television only days earlier had already shattered the illusion of competence. Now, the Prime Minister's sudden election gamble made him look less like a strong leader and more like a man cornered, lashing out with his final card before the game was up. And still, the scandal loomed in the background, bigger than any election strategy. Reports whispered of investigators closing in on transfers that linked directly back to figures in Starmer's inner circle. Documents had gone missing. Contracts had been quietly signed off under suspicious terms. Whistleblowers hinted at fraud on a scale that could end not just Starmer's career, but the credibility of his entire government. For Labour MPs on the campaign trail, it was a nightmare scenario. Instead of talking about policy or change, they faced angry questions from voters demanding answers about billions that had vanished and a leader they no longer trusted. In safe Labour strongholds, where once victory had been assured, canvassers reported doors slammed in their faces, the betrayal cutting deeper than any policy debate ever could. For Starmer himself, the gamble was simple. Call an election now, frame it as a choice between Labour's stability and the chaos of opposition, and hope that voters would give him one more chance before the scandal could explode. But the danger was just as clear. If the evidence reached the public before polling day, the early election wouldn't save him. It would destroy him, live, in front of the entire nation. And with Nigel Farage surging, the Conservatives regrouping, and his own MPs in open revolt, the gamble was looking less like a strategy and more like political suicide. The question hanging over Britain now was chilling in its simplicity. Has Keir Starmer just played his final card and lost? As dawn broke the day after Starmer's announcement, Westminster was already in open turmoil. What should have been a moment of unity for Labour quickly spiralled into chaos. Senior MPs, who had stood shoulder to shoulder with Starmer during the election victory, now refused to appear alongside him in public. Some even went so far as to cancel campaign events entirely, unwilling to face angry crowds demanding explanations for the £22 billion scandal. The shockwaves of Rachel Reeves' televised breakdown still lingered, her tearful admission replayed endlessly on every channel. reminding voters that the government's economic promises had collapsed before their very eyes. But now, with the election clock ticking, the pressure was unbearable. And for Labour, every passing hour felt like quicksand, pulling them deeper into disaster. Behind closed doors, the picture was even darker. Emergency meetings stretched late into the night, as party strategists struggled to map a campaign strategy around a leader whose credibility was evaporating. Leaked memos revealed desperation. Instead of focusing on growth and reform, Labour would attempt to make the election about trust versus chaos, painting the Conservatives and Reform UK as dangerous risks to the nation's stability. But the flaw in that strategy was glaring. Trust was the very thing Starmer had already lost. Every poll showed approval ratings sinking to record lows, while Nigel Farage's Reform UK surged, drawing crowds in regions Labour once considered impenetrable. The working-class base that had been the foundation of Labour's power was slipping away, seduced by Farage's fiery speeches and his promise to give Britain back to the people. For ordinary citizens, the £22 billion scandal was no longer abstract. It was personal. People facing rising taxes, stagnant wages, and crumbling public services wanted to know why billions had vanished from government accounts. Social media erupted daily with new speculation: missing documents, mysterious transfers, whispers of corruption at the highest levels. Petitions demanding Starmer's resignation passed 500,000 signatures, while hashtags like #StarmerResign and #LabourCollapse trended relentlessly. The government's attempt to spin the scandal as a mere accounting discrepancy had failed catastrophically. Voters no longer believed the excuses, and worse for Labour, the story refused to fade. Every day, new leaks surfaced, each more damaging than the last. Starmer's opponents smelled blood, and they pounced. Rishi Sunak, once humbled by defeat, found his footing in opposition, hammering Starmer as a Prime Minister who runs from the truth. Conservative MPs flooded media outlets with coordinated attacks, portraying Labour as a party built on lies and betrayal. Meanwhile, Farage was merciless. At one rally, he held up a newspaper headline about the scandal and declared, "This is not politics as usual, this is theft of the people's trust." His words drew thunderous applause, the crowd chanting, "Send them packing," over and over again. Television cameras captured it all, broadcasting the message into millions of homes, turning Farage from an agitator into a political juggernaut. Inside the Labour Party, fear turned to mutiny. Anonymous briefings from MPs painted a picture of despair, senior figures openly questioning whether Starmer should even lead them into the election. Some whispered of forcing a leadership challenge mid-campaign, a move that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. Others argued that it was already too late. The damage was done, and the best Labour could hope for was damage control, saving seats rather than saving power. One shadow minister, caught on a hot mic, summed it up bluntly: "We're walking into a slaughter." Markets, too, refused to stay quiet. Analysts warned that the uncertainty of an early election, combined with the unresolved financial scandal, could trigger capital flight. The pound wobbled again, and whispers of a credit downgrade emerged. For investors, the sight of a government unravelling was enough to reignite fears of instability not seen since the worst days of Brexit negotiations. And for ordinary families, these warnings were more than headlines. They translated into higher mortgage rates, rising costs, and growing anger at a government that had promised relief but delivered turmoil. The timing of Starmer's gamble looked increasingly catastrophic. By calling an election now, he had hoped to seize control of the story. Instead, he had magnified it. The campaign trail became a battlefield of betrayal and scandal, every Labour promise drowned out by chants of, "Where's the £22 billion?" At town halls, voters demanded answers. At doorsteps, canvassers were met with hostility. And on television, panellists who once praised Starmer's steady leadership now tore him apart, as a man undone by his own hubris. But the most dangerous part for Starmer was still ahead. Investigators, emboldened by mounting leaks, were moving quickly. Reports suggested that a trail of transfers connected suspiciously close to Starmer's own advisors, raising the terrifying prospect that the scandal could become criminal just as voters went to the polls. Allies whispered nervously about police raids, subpoenas and arrests, rumours that, whether true or not, only fuelled the sense of a government in freefall. The narrative was slipping further out of Starmer's hands, and no announcement, no rally, no speech could claw it back. In that sense, the election had already become more than just a contest of policies or personalities. It was now a referendum on trust, honesty and betrayal. And with every new headline, every new leak, Keir Starmer looked less like a leader fighting for Britain's future and more like a man desperately fighting for his own survival. What he had hoped would be a controlled march to victory had turned into a spectacle of collapse, with every news cycle dominated not by Labour's pledges, but by the fallout from the £22 billion scandal. Across the country, Labour candidates were drowning in the chaos, their campaign leaflets buried under a tidal wave of anger. Constituents no longer wanted to talk about policies on schools or hospitals. They wanted one thing only: answers about the missing billions. In working-class towns that had once been Labour's fortress, the fury was palpable. Pensioners demanded to know why their savings were being eaten away by inflation, while billions disappeared without explanation. Families struggling to pay rent shouted at campaigners that Labour had betrayed the people. The betrayal narrative had stuck, and it was spreading like a plague. Meanwhile, the corridors of Westminster had become a place of open rebellion. Starmer's authority, once ironclad, was now eroded to whispers and shadows. Cabinet ministers clashed in furious meetings, some insisting that the party double down and fight, while others openly suggested that Starmer step aside before he dragged the entire party into oblivion. Leaked audio from one late-night strategy session revealed senior Labour figures describing the election as political suicide and accusing Starmer of sacrificing the party for his own survival. These leaks, deliberately fed to the press by disillusioned insiders, tore apart any illusion of unity. For the public, the message was clear. Labour wasn't leading Britain. It couldn't even lead itself. As the mutiny grew, so too did the power of Nigel Farage. Reform UK, once dismissed as a fringe threat, was now dominating headlines. Farage's rallies became a phenomenon, filling town squares with thousands of supporters chanting his slogans. His attacks on Starmer were ruthless, mocking him as the man who lost £22 billion and then ran from the people. Clips of his speeches went viral, striking a chord with voters who felt ignored, abandoned, and deceived. Polls showed Reform UK surging in regions Labour had considered unshakable. Even the so-called Red Wall looked ready to crumble, with lifelong Labour voters now openly pledging allegiance to Farage. The Conservatives, battered but not broken, were quietly regaining ground as well, positioning themselves as the safer alternative to chaos. For the first time in decades, Labour faced not one opponent, but two, both feeding on its collapse. The media, sensing blood, circled like vultures. Headlines screamed of Labour's implosion and Starmer's last days. Front pages splashed with new details of the scandal, secret accounts, undisclosed contracts, and missing records. Investigators, emboldened by the public outrage, leaked hints that charges could soon follow. The story escalated from whispers of incompetence to the possibility of corruption at the very heart of government. Commentators warned that Britain might be heading into an election where the sitting Prime Minister could be dragged into a courtroom rather than Downing Street. For voters, the distinction between truth and rumour no longer mattered. The perception was enough. Labour was corrupt, broken, and finished. Markets added fuel to the fire. Investors, already jittery, began pulling out. Reports of capital flight surfaced, and the pound slipped further against the dollar. Mortgage rates climbed, food prices ticked upward, and every household began to feel the sting. The connection was easy for voters to make. Labour had lost billions, and ordinary families were paying the price. Starmer's carefully crafted image as the man who brought stability after Conservative chaos had evaporated entirely. In its place stood a leader portrayed as dishonest, panicked, and dangerously out of his depth. For Starmer himself, the campaign trail became a gauntlet of humiliation. At town halls, he faced hostile crowds shouting, "Where's the money?" In interviews, journalists grilled him relentlessly, refusing to let him steer the conversation back to policy. Every attempt to project calm authority was undercut by the chaos surrounding him. Even his body language betrayed the pressure. Clenched fists, strained smiles, eyes darting nervously as though he could feel the ground giving way beneath him. His speeches, once polished and commanding, now sounded hollow, echoing with promises no one believed. Meanwhile, Labour MPs braced for disaster. Constituency offices reported unprecedented levels of hostility, with staff quitting under the abuse. Doorstep canvassing became dangerous, with volunteers heckled, jeered, and in some cases chased away. The fear of annihilation spread through the party ranks. Some MPs began quietly reaching out to rival parties, exploring escape routes for their political careers. Others begged Starmer to resign immediately, hoping that a last-minute change of leadership might salvage something from the wreckage. But Starmer refused, insisting he was fighting for the people, a phrase that now rang hollow even to those closest to him. And through it all, the shadow of the investigation loomed larger. Reports suggested that investigators had uncovered a paper trail linking suspicious transfers directly to government figures. The rumour of impending police raids hung over the campaign like a guillotine. Journalists whispered of sealed indictments, and broadcasters speculated openly about the possibility of a Prime Minister facing charges before polling day. Whether or not it was true no longer mattered. The perception alone was enough to poison the campaign beyond repair. Labour's message had been drowned out entirely by scandal and speculation, leaving Starmer as a leader trapped in a storm of his own making. Could Keir Starmer even survive until polling day without being toppled by his own party or engulfed by scandal? The answer, whispered across Westminster, was chillingly uncertain. As the campaign entered its final stretch, the sense of doom surrounding Keir Starmer was no longer confined to whispers in Westminster. It had spread across the nation like wildfire. What had begun as a shock announcement meant to seize control of the political agenda had instead spiralled into a full-blown disaster. The Prime Minister, once praised as a figure of competence and stability, was now seen as a desperate man clinging to power while the walls collapsed around him. His election gamble, meant to silence scandal, had dragged it into the harsh glare of the spotlight. And now, with days left before Britain went to the polls, the weight of the £22 billion scandal had transformed his campaign into a funeral march. Inside Labour headquarters, the atmosphere was suffocating. Emergency meetings had become daily rituals, each one more frantic than the last. Advisors huddled over polling data that told the same grim story. Reform UK was surging, the Conservatives were regaining ground, and Labour's numbers were plummeting. Senior MPs openly refused to campaign with Starmer, fearing that standing beside him would mean political suicide. Some even cut deals with local activists to distance themselves from the national campaign, a rare and humiliating sight for a party that only months ago believed it would dominate British politics for a decade. One Labour veteran, speaking to the press off record, summed it up in brutal fashion. He's finished. The only question now is whether he takes the rest of us down with him. Meanwhile, the scandal itself grew darker by the hour. Investigators, emboldened by the public outrage, were reported to have uncovered evidence of shadow accounts and questionable transfers tied directly to government contracts. Journalists spoke of sealed files, of subpoenas ready to be issued, and of names inside Starmer's own circle being read aloud in closed-door hearings. Though nothing had yet been proven in court, the perception was already damning. Every leak, every rumour, every front-page headline painted the same picture. A Prime Minister entangled in a financial scandal of historic proportions. Television pundits compared it to the expenses crisis, to Watergate, even to the downfall of past leaders who thought themselves untouchable.